Hi, I'm Caralise. I'm the author of this book, The Final Choice, and a journalist. Thank you for having me today. I'm excited to share with you a little bit about my story and what I've found through my own research on this issue. So late last year, I went to a freelance writing job, and it was a meeting, and there I heard a little bit about assisted dying, and I came away from that meeting thinking, what is this that we're talking about? I knew that it would be in a binding referendum with this election, but little else. So as any good journalist does, curiosity kicks in and you go and do your research, you do some Googling and start looking into the topic. And so that's what I did. And the more I got into it, the more I realized this is a really big deal and it's very complex. And I sat down with a friend and had a cup of coffee and was talking about what I was finding. And they said, hey, why don't you take your journey, go on a journey of discovery and turn it into a book? And it was a left field idea for me, but I came away from that thinking, you know what, this is a very important conversation that we need to have in our country. And there's a lot of a lack of understanding about what we're actually being asked. So I went on the journey. As part of that, I interviewed over 20 experts. So I talked to campaigners, I talked to lawyers, to doctors, I talked to those with terminal illnesses and disabilities, and I welcomed their input on the conversation, their perspective. I chose the people to interview from the Justice Select Committee. So as this piece of legislation went through the parliamentary process, the Justice Select Committee was called upon to take submissions. In that process, there was a record number, nearly 40,000 submissions came in, which was the highest number of submissions ever recorded through this process. And over 90% of those submissions were opposed to this bill, this act that it now is, and 10% were for it approximately. And I thought, why? Why is this? So I came to that point of needing to ask its experts, what is going on here? So that's all contained in my book. It is an amazing and brilliant read. It's bad to say it yourself, but it's true. I'm really proud of it. And I would just encourage you, if you're looking for further information, Jack Havel that you're going to hear and Sinead Donnelly both feature in the book. It contains interviews from both sides. Also, palliative care specialist Roderick McLeod is in there, and a number of other voices. So you can get a copy at your bookstore or at thefinalchoice.nz. So glad to have that part out of the way. I just want to share with you a couple of findings from that process. So the intention of this book project for me really was to get people informed. Look, I don't mind what you vote. I'm so glad that you are engaging in this conversation. My main focus is please at least get informed. Don't go into this conversation. It's an intense thing to be asked. Don't go in on your gut instinct alone. Please do your research. One of the things that I learnt pretty quickly and pretty early on was that what we're being asked in New Zealand about the End of Life Choice Act is actually an extremely important question. I interviewed someone called Margaret Somerville who has 9 doctorates. She's a bioethicist from Australia. She spent time in Canada as they were looking at this law and introducing it over there, or an equivalent of this law. And she said, this question that we are being asked in New Zealand at this time is the most important values decision of the 21st century. And that importance was echoed through interviews with the lawyers, the Queen's Council member, and others in the conversation. Look, we need to realise that we are being asked for the very, very not first, but there's very few other times that we're being asked such a significant question. We are looking at legalising whether it is okay for one person to kill another person, to inject that final dose with the intention to kill. So we have to realise at the get-go, this is a massive decision, and the implication will be significant on the legal and the professional industry, the healthcare industry, and on every single Kiwi as we approach our end of life. So something to know from the start when you approach this binding referendum is that we're being asked not what is your view on assisted dying, The cannabis referendum that we will also be voting on is not binding, and that is more asking us, in principle, do we support the recreational use of cannabis? But this question that we're going to be asked is, do you support the End of Life Choice Act? So that's a very important thing to note, that we're not being asked in principle, do you support this idea? We're being asked, do you support this very specific piece of legislation? And if more than 50% of us vote yes to that, this law is already ready. It's not going to be changed or modified. It is sitting in wait, just waiting for that final tick. It will become live within 12 months. It will be operational. So we have to look very carefully at this law, and we have to not only know what it is, but we have to analyse, is this the right law to legalise this in our country? We have to look at the detail, we have to test, is this robust enough? And we in some ways have to become mini lawyers, mini MPs, and actually ask some really tough questions. So get your analytical minds on, get into your assessment genes, and just start to look at this at that perspective. Is this the right law? Is this going to achieve what we want to achieve and protect what we want to protect? Look, from really early on, there's some amazingly passionate people engaged in the conversation. I think at times it's portrayed that one choice is dignified or one choice is compassionate and the other is not. But what I found is every single person I spoke to across the spectrum, they all approach this topic with the intention to maintain dignity to the end of life and to provide absolute compassionate care. So look, regardless of what your outcome is, regardless of who you're listening to, that is the heart and the driving force behind this conversation. We want to ensure people are well cared for. And so I found that incredibly encouraging and unifying, that we're trying to solve this problem together. So that's always something good to keep in the back of your mind as we journey through this. Is this law going to relieve the suffering that it's intentioned to, while protecting those that it needs to? Look, when many of us approach this subject, what we actually bring immediately to the conversation is this idea of autonomy and choice. We really want to allow people as much choice in life as possible, especially as they're going through a very difficult time. And that's what this law is looking at. Can we allow this choice for some? But interestingly enough as well, we all are familiar with the legal scales, so that picture of the balancing scales when it comes to creating law and lawmaking. And on one side of that scale, we have autonomy and choice, but the other side is also protection of citizens. So good lawmaking needs to weigh those two things up together and see, will this piece of legislation uphold both ends of that in a good balance? To get an idea of what good lawmaking practice actually looks like, one of the people I interviewed was Queen's Council member Grant Illingworth, and he took me through a couple of questions that we can ask to test if this law is indeed robust. So questions like, will the safeguards included be able to weed out those who shouldn't have access to this? Is the eligibility criteria, such as the one based on prognosis of 6 months, is it a reliable test? Is it a reliable line in the sand that we definitely know this will be the right person eligible? Or a question like, is 2 doctors doing their best to assess for coercion a good enough protection to ensure that someone is not being pressured into this from a family member or from even just the concept of being a burden on society? Is 2 doctors doing their best to research and assess the intention of the person, the motivation of the person is clear from coercion? And that's a really tough question. So an interesting point talking about coercion that I found while researching some of these laws internationally is over in Oregon in the United States, they've legalized assisted suicide. So that's a form of assisted dying where you administer it yourself. So over there it's legal, and what they found is that the average length that a doctor has a relationship with the patient, the doctor that is willing to administer this or willing to at least prescribe this, that relationship length from the beginning meeting the patient to the patient taking the dose, the average length is 10 to 14 weeks. It's not a long time to know the patient. And that's a pattern that's actually seen throughout the nearly or just above 13 jurisdictions that have legalised equivalent laws. To note, more than 30 have rejected this law and around 13 have accepted it or a version of it. So some laws contain just euthanasia, that's when the doctor, or euthanasia and assisted suicide, that's when the doctor administers that last dose, or it's self-administered, and some jurisdictions have only legalised assisted suicide. So Victoria State in Australia, just assisted suicide. All of the states in the United States that have legalised this, just assisted suicide. So that's an interesting factor, just something to know when we look at ours. It's including both. So internationally, what you see is that in Canada, for example, there is a small portion of doctors that have agreed to participate in this process. So over there, you've got about 130 doctors from across the entire nation of Canada that will be willing to administer this. Even within that 130, there is a number, just over 20, that would be willing to be the second doctor assessing, but they won't participate in actually releasing the lethal dose. So even again, just knowing that there's going to be a small group, most probably a small group within New Zealand that will be willing to do this, and the average doctor-patient relationship will be quite short. So again, is this a strong enough safeguard for a doctor to assess coercion within that context? And I provide those examples merely to say, look, there's a lot that goes on in this conversation. We need to consider the context, and somehow we've got to find and dig into this act and not only look at what is within the act, but look at what is not in the act. So every other jurisdiction that has legalised a form of this have what you call a cooling off period. So that's a certain number of days between when that application is made to when that person can have it administered. So generally speaking, it's somewhere between 9 to 15 days cooling off period. In our law, it's not included. It's not in there. So again, this is why we've got to get some good information. Whatever you vote, whatever you decide on, it's coming to that place with the knowledge that of whether this is robust, whether it will allow, and whether if this is the right law for us. Last little bit of information I want to share with you has been something that has sparked interest with a number of people I've spoken to, and so it really comes from that concept of what are we trying to relieve here. And so I looked overseas in Oregon and Washington. They have some really interesting reviews at the end of every year. They produce a report. Their questions to those applying for this is very thorough. And one of the questions they ask is, what are the primary reasons behind you asking for this medication or this treatment or this action? And so as I journeyed through this, I just assumed the number one reason people are using this would be for pain or for fear of pain coming to that point in their illness. But what I found is number one motivational factor that people chose to take this was that they felt less able to engage in activities that were enjoyable in life. That was over 90% of people said that is why they wanted this treatment. Other factors included loss of dignity, feeling that they were a burden on family, friends, society, 59%, and that pain motivation was actually down at 30%, quite low on the list. So again, I just encourage you, look into this, think hard, somehow get to that point where you can lay aside some of your personal struggle with the concept and just really try and analytically look at the law and test if this is the right one. Again, encourage you, if you want more, there's plenty of good stories in the book that I've written. Please get a copy and enjoy the rest of this conversation and webinar. Thanks for listening.